Hello. Now it works. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to tonight's panel in relation to the exhibition Truths and Reckoning. My name is Sabine Ekman. I'm the director and chief curator here at the Kemper Art Museum. And before we get started and I introduce everyone, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about the format of tonight's discussion and panel. What we will do is that we will have a panel here between the participants talking a little bit about the exhibition and responses to the exhibition, yet also the larger issues the exhibition brings up. After that, we will not do a formal discussion between audience and panel as it is usually or often done, but we will really join you on the tables and will continue with a discussion in a more informal setting than this kind of official questioning and answer setting. We also here at the Kemper Art Museum do understand that both the content of the exhibition and the images can be very challenging. So please take care of yourself in any way you need during tonight's discussion. If you find that you need someone to hold space with you, please reach out to trained staff at the Behavioral Health Response Center. On each table there is a phone number included. And with that, I would like to introduce tonight's speakers. That is Jeff Ward, the curator of the exhibition. He's Associate Professor of African and African American Studies and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology and American Cultural Studies here at Washington University in St. Louis. His scholarship examines the racial politics of social control and the pursuit of racial justice historically and today. His work appears in numerous academic journals and anthologies and has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the Ford Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. In addition to numerous research articles and essays, he's the author of the book, The Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice, which came out and is published by the University of Chicago Press in 2012. And an award-winning book on the rise, fall, and haunting remnants of Jim Crow juvenile justice. His current projects examine histories of racial violence, their legacy, and implications for repair. Next to me is Shira Skorman, a St. Louis native. She is a cross-genre writer, multi-medium storyteller, and public speaker whose work spans poetry, essay writing, photography, film production, music, and advertising. She is a community-centered social entrepreneur and helping professional devoted to the visibility, care, and healing of underserved and marginalized populations. Shiraz is a two-time TED Gateway Arch Speaker and was the 2018-19 Storytelling Fellow at the Empower Institute. She's also a member of the St. Louis Community Remembrance Project Coalition, of which we will hear more later today. And lastly, Tahari Coleman is an MPA. He is a consultant and social justice advocate who facilitates diversity and inclusion training programs. He works as the director of professional development for the Anti-Defamation League and oversees the development of skills training for ADL's National Cadre of Facilitators, leads national Train the Trainer workshops, and supports national and regional education staff with professional development learning opportunities. Tabari is also a trainer for the National Conference for Community and Justice, where he has been facilitating anti-oppression programs, youth leadership development, and building inclusive communities workshops since 2002. Please join me before we start talking to welcome all three speakers here. And with that, I will give the word to the curator of the exhibition, Jeff Ward, who will introduce the concepts underlying the exhibition. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Sabine. I'm going to take off my watch and observe the time because I could just keep going and going, and I don't want to. I want to speak very briefly about the ideas here and then move into a discussion. I'm especially excited about the format that was chosen so that we can engage with all of you in conversations about the issues that the exhibit raises. I want to first thank the Kemper Museum, Sabine, the director, Meredith, the two Merediths who I've worked closely with, who are over here, the curator and the director of education, and Kim, who's, I don't believe is here tonight, who is the registrar, and Rochelle, I think I see in the back, I don't have my glasses on, who's done so much to help with bringing this together. I'm very grateful. I'm an historical sociologist. Most of what I do is work in archives and work on research papers and publications, and the opportunity to do something creative, to engage these ideas, and hopefully to engage the public in a more meaningful way is very important to me. I strive to have a more public-facing academic practice than is typical in academia, and so this was a really tremendous opportunity, the teaching gallery program at Kemper Art Museum. As Sabine mentioned, most of my work has been concerned with questions of race and justice, and I first got into thinking about legacies of racial violence and writing the book that Sabine mentioned, which deals with the history of the racial politics of juvenile justice. And in that work, I was struck by the book is really mostly about how generations of black women organized against Jim Crow juvenile justice systems, which they conceptualized as genocidal institutions that were killing the seeds of a people by systematically depriving black people, black children, of opportunities to realize their full potential, whilst providing opportunities for self-realization to particularly to white boys and girls. And so they saw this as projecting into the future collective black social, economic, and political disadvantage. And that really struck me as a young sociologist, just sort of thinking about the timescales of harm and how it is carried forward potentially by generations, and trying to understand how does that work culturally and structurally, and what do we do about that, given the fact that we are in this moment, inheritors in a way of so much of the genealogical and structural advantage and disadvantage that's been organized in the society along racial and ethnic lines. What do we do to better acknowledge and ultimately to address this kind of yoke of history that has us in its grasp, even though it's not often visible to us? So this is part of why in the teaching gallery, what I really wanted to do was kind of tap into what is, I think, a larger moment of reckoning right now. I won't get into it. I'm sure our conversations will bring this up, but we're in this moment now that I think is, in the wake of this sort of resurgence of white nationalism in this country, you see a number of efforts to finally and more effectively come to terms with the haunting legacies of white settler colonialism and enslavement, histories of genocide, of racial terror, other atrocity. And so the exhibit is really, I think, best understood as one drop in that larger kind of ocean of activity work by a number of artists, many of whom are here. Shiraz sitting next to me, Damon Davis, who's in the audience, who's a visiting artist in the Department of African American Studies. a number of artists in St. Louis, around the country, have been doing this work with some increased intensity in recent years. A number of authors have been writing about this, books like Underground Airlines and Ta-Nehisi Coates' fiction and nonfiction works, and numerous other works, Jesmond Ward's work on intergenerational trauma. There's just a sort of groundswell, I think, of reckoning that this exhibition really grows out of. Museums and memorials are also important sites of activity today, and I think we'll talk a little bit about this in the context of the St. Louis Community Remembrance Coalition, which is an offshoot of Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial to Peace and Justice, and their museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration. All around the country and indeed all around the world, we see this sort of effort to engage people in this sort of essential practice of facing history in ourselves if we indeed intend to address these haunting legacies. I should say, in my own work, part of what drives me to do this, I mentioned my work on juvenile justice, but since that work, I began looking at how other histories of racial violence affect subsequent outcomes. And in that work, what we've mostly focused on, and we being the many students and faculty collaborators I've written with and done research with on this, we've looked primarily at how histories of enslavement and lynching relate to subsequent patterns of conflict, violence, and inequality in the same places. And what we've seen in this research, and this is all systematic empirical research where we build pretty substantial databases to look at a number of factors simultaneously, and we ask, does the history of racial violence in an area, typically a county, help to explain subsequent patterns of violence, conflict, and inequality? And study after study is showing that indeed these histories remain predictive of contemporary outcomes. This has been shown for homicide rates today. It's been shown for rates of incarceration, the use of capital punishment, white supremacist mobilization, white political conservatism. All of these have been shown to be related to the history of lynching at the county level. So every additional lynching in the history of the county, or the higher percent of the population enslaved in the history of the county, the more adverse these outcomes I've listed are today, net of other factors. Our most recent paper showed that histories of lynching at the county level are very strong predictors of the odds that children will be corporally punished in schools today in 12 southern states. Every additional lynching in the history of the county corresponds with an increase in the likelihood that black kids in particular, will be corporally punished today. So in light of this work, this social science research, I've been really interested in figuring out, one, how does this intergenerational transmission work? How is it that we embody and reproduce this racial trauma, and what do we do about it? And so just wrap up by saying a little bit about the idea of the teaching gallery and some of the sort of key points I'm trying to express there. I mentioned I could go on and on. There is an essay that goes on and on. If you'd like to read it, in the gallery there's an essay that describes at some length the sort of idea of the design of the exhibition, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. But let me just highlight a couple things. One is that the exhibition primarily takes aim at the sort of at the sort of how memory works within our political culture today, and really the desire to sort of look away, to not know this history, or to forget it without having known it, or without having owned it in its legacy. So it's really an attempt to stage encounters with difficult truths and to challenge people to sit with those truths and to process them, and most importantly, to draw connections between them. So the exhibition is set up in a loosely chronological way, but there's no guidance on which way you should go when you go in the room. And that was in part to attempt to disorient people in terms of time and place. You know, when did this happen and where are we? Is this in the South? Is this in the North? Was this a century ago? Was this last year, with the hope of achieving the effect of sort of conveying a realization of what I've said that empirical research shows us already, that the past remains present, that this is not a problem that is reducible to the sort of, anomalous Deep South. It also takes aim at these pernicious notions that, histories of enslavement were not so bad, or these things happened so long ago, they're not relevant to us today. One of the books, there are a few books in the I don't know what you call the shop over there. Not a
bookstore?
The bookstore. Well, there are other things too. There's like a
Pop-up bookstore?
There's a pop-up bookstore. I was going to talk about the Highway Way. You could take it home. Anyway, there are a few, but one of the books over there is by an author named Michael Rothberg, who wrote a book called The Implicated Subject. And I'm going to end with this point so we can move into hearing from others. But The Implicated Subject, the book that hopefully the exhibition will help people appreciate how we are all implicated subjects in this history. In the book, The Implicated Subject, the subtitle is Beyond Victims and Perpetrators. Rothberg is trying to push against this idea that there were some people who were victims and some people who were perpetrators, but we are neither of them. We weren't there. My parents didn't own. I didn't own slaves. I didn't enslave anyone. I didn't participate in any of these atrocities that are being referenced. But what the book does a very powerful job, I think, of conveying is that we are all in that in-between space as implicated subjects. We are perhaps not, we certainly are not people who were there in reference to several of these events, although some of the events are contemporary, like the contemporary police violence. But we are all implicated in the question of what do we do about these legacies in contemporary social relations. So I hope you find the exhibit at least stimulating and interesting. I'm looking forward to having conversations about the work.
Thank you so much. And I would immediately ask both, and I don't know which order you want to go. Do you want to start, Shiraz, to respond a little bit to this concept of the exhibition, and maybe to some of the images you found most interesting, most complicated, most difficult, or maybe just most meaningful to yourself?
Good evening, everyone. There is so much in that gallery that it was hard for me to find one particular thing. However, the thing that I avoided the most was the figurines called Gold Digger, where they are these contraptions that were used to muffle enslaved women. Things to be worn around the neck, such as veils, so your every move can be noticed. If you dared to escape, you could be heard. And the lengths that people would go to, packing them with mud or with feces to stop the sound. And I believe the reason why I avoided those figurines so much is because I think that's something that we don't want to acknowledge about enslavement, is the level of brutality that was endured. And, oh, they aren't in my slides.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No, they're not there. Yeah, and it's fascinating to me how anybody could think that enslavement was somehow easy, and that it was a joyous occasion. There's an amazing documentary titled Ethnic Notions. This documentary was released in the 1980s. And The documentary is so moving because it actually starts to break down the different tropes and how these different tropes were created. But for us to acknowledge the brutality of slavery, but how that got dampened via advertising. I sit on this panel today as a 20-year ad industry executive, copywriter and creative director and brand strategist. And for me, the mastery in shaping these narratives through pop music. How many of you all are familiar with the fact that pop music actually became a thing because of these songs that were developed during a time where the justification of enslavement needed to really be pressed upon in the South and in the North? So for me, those figurines were just a little too much for me to take. And it resonated with me, and I just had to have a moment to be very thankful for my ancestors for surviving, those who lived through enslavement, and everything that came with that. Because regardless of the flowery narrative that we try to say about enslaved women and masters, there is no consensual relationship between an enslaved person and their master. So I had an enormous amount of gratitude, and still do, you know, for my ancestors who survived the atrocities of enslavement for me to be here today as a Black woman.
Thank you so much.
Well, good evening. So I was moved in a number of ways by the exhibit. This piece that you see here is by Rashid Johnson, and it was probably 5 years ago was the first opportunity I had to do any work with the Kemper, and it was during the Rashid Johnson's exhibition here. And it was the first time that I had come into a museum where I saw myself. I saw images, I saw content, I saw things that weren't just about slavery, and which I could relate to, and it was a powerful experience to be able to see that. And so in thinking about the pieces that sort of stood out for me, the Rashid Johnson was definitely one of them. I bought the book, so I have it. I don't typically over the pop-up gift shop, right, when it got that. But it was moving for me to be able to see that, and again, to be able to focus in on the content. And then the second, and if you wouldn't mind advancing, sure. I think I saw that. This Bruce Davidson, you know, this one, I struggled with this. I struggled with this because here is a young man draping himself in the American flag, representing a country that does not see him as American. And so even though this is from 1933, if I saw a child with this flag draped around them today, I would have the same feeling. 65? Sorry. And so my struggle was this notion of what it means to be Black in America, whether or not we are truly seen as Americans. That image, that thought, that perception of being an American is not something that I always see representative of Black folks here. And so this piece really stood out, and then his eyes. And it was almost as if he was asking us to see him, to see the trauma, to see the pain, to see the struggle that continues to be perpetuated in our society on Black and brown bodies. And so both of those pieces, both the Rashid Johnson made me see myself, and then this piece reminded me that I'm not fully appreciated or represented in our society today.
Thank you. I originally wanted to dwell a little bit more on this issue, what it means to confront the past and the present. You did sort of, to a large extent, already answer the questions I had, but I'm not sure, Cherise or Tabari, if there's anything you would like to add. Jeff obviously made the point about the continuation, and specifically from a sociological, empirical perspective of the presence of the past. I do think that his exhibition, from my perspective at least, is also a warning, to sort of mobilize really a confrontation with the past in order to affect at least some kind of change of consciousness, if not action. And so in that sense, you did sort of answer my question, but if you have any more comment to that, feel free to just answer that now. But I wanted to give both of you, Tabari and Shiraz, also the opportunity to say something about this kind of difficult relationship and complex relationship, I think, between past and present.
And we can go to my slides.
Sure.
Is this yours?
Yes, so
Okay.
we can go to the next.
Okay.
So this in particular, and we can go to we're going to go through a series of slides with this, and this image grabbed me. This is titled "The Plantation Police or Home Guard Examining Passes on the Road Leading to the Levee of the Mississippi River." This reminded me of watching some young black men at the Metrolink station a few years ago, where I was like, the past is so present, even the expression on the gentleman's face who's in the foreground, where he's kind of like just holding his past out and just wanted to go about his life, wanted to go about his business. And in the summer, I think that was the summer of 2016, we had armed police officers at Metrolink stations in the Del Mar Loop requesting black children to give their IDs to show why they needed to be in that place. So for me, this was an example of how the past is so present. So we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, the next two. Oh, the next one. Yeah, so, and we can just kind of click through the lynching crowds. The reason why yes, thank you. The reason why I felt that these were the past coming right into our present is that we are probably sitting in a room with some descendants, living in the same neighborhood as descendants of these people who gathered at lynchings, held picnics, sent postcards, had family time as a singular black person or multiple black people, because there are records of multiple people being lynched at one time. And not only African Americans, but people of Mexican descent as well. And I had an opportunity to go through the Hampton Archives, which is on West Campus of Washington University. And I've come to find out that there was an issue with some of the footage being released because some of the descendants of the people who were captured, by Hampton in the different interviews and stuff, they would not sign releases. And one woman's response stuck out to me. She said, "I don't want people to think that my grandfather was a racist." So she refused the release being signed for the footage. And that right there, that type of knowing, and that type of, it's a historical erasure, it's dishonest. And I was like, Lord, you're probably a school teacher. You're probably somebody's nurse. You are probably in some position of power, and you do not have the fortitude or integrity to acknowledge Your grandfather, who Hampton has on camera, being a bona fide racist, being a bona fide bigot. But since you don't want people to think your grandfather was a racist, the public never gets the opportunity to see the reality.
Hello? So going back to the question about visibility and the role of museums, if you will, in bringing sort of these concepts to life in a different way, I'm reminded of James Baldwin, who said, "Not all things that are faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so it reminds me that museums, other cultural institutions have an opportunity to raise our awareness by exposing us to different ways in which these stories get played out in our society. You know, it isn't so much that museums just bring about visibility, but that we have to think about how we are accountable to what it is that we're seeing. You know, Shiraz is telling the story of the woman who didn't want to be perceived as a racist. And I think about how many of us don't want to be perceived as having prejudice or bias, that's seen as a negative. And I'm not suggesting it isn't negative, but the reality is that we all have bias and prejudice. And our country has not provided an opportunity for more of us to not only learn about our history, but to be able to take ownership and acknowledge that truth. You know, I hear words like racist thrown out there so often today that I wonder if we're really being thoughtful about how we're using it, or if we're at times, and I use this word loosely, you know, that there's this overreaction to prejudices, because I think that we all have prejudice, right? And I never want in any way for us to water down what racism really looks like just because people are ignorant. I think that there are chances for museums to bring about sessions like this where the community comes together, hopefully not just to listen to a few people share their thoughts and perspectives, but for us to really be honest with ourselves about how we feel about the people sitting next to us, about how we feel about the institution that has brought us here, and the role that this institution plays in the broader St. Louis community. How we're thinking about the ways in which the exhibit and where it is. You know, I can't help, and I don't mean to be critical, so I'll apologize in advance, but Shiraz and I were talking about even the placement of exhibits like this in our institutions. I was at SLAM this morning doing a workshop for their docents and having a conversation about where the African American Arts exhibit is in the museum. And where is it? In the basement, right? And so, again, it's about being able to notice those things. You know, Dorothy Soleil said, privilege is being able to choose what you will not see. And so it's easy for us not to pay attention to certain things because it was never really brought to light. And I don't say that as a criticism of the museum because of where it is, but for us to always be considering, as we are bringing visibility to an issue, are we also still sort of perpetuating certain ideas by continuing to put certain pieces in different places.
I just wanted to add a bit about your question on the presence of the past, and to stress that two things. One is to stress the idea that this is a pop-up memorial museum, and so pop-up, both parts of that are important. The memorial museums are intended to use education and commemoration around past injustice to deepen contemporary commitments to equal justice and to ensure future justice. They're exemplified by, you know, Holocaust museums and the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, England, and EJI's Memorial and Museum in Montgomery. And so this is the concept behind this exhibition. And I call it a pop-up in part because it is living in a place where you wouldn't really expect it. This is an art museum, it's not a history museum. It is going to come up and go down in a relatively short period of time. It's not permanent, which I think has some advantages actually. With one of the other books in the pop-up bookshop is, everything is popping up these days, is called Exhibiting Atrocity. And it's a very critical analysis of memorial museums, which are often co-opted by the state to pretend as if we've moved on from the past and resolved the past. And there's no pretense around that in this case. I just also want to point out that I agree about it'd be better if it were here, right here, but next, after this one comes down, something else will pop up, and it might be like, 14th century Dutch furniture makers or something. It'll be in that same space. It is a bit of a irony, I think. The point is still an important point about where these voices tend to live. And it's not only in museums that's the case. It's in virtually all of our fields. It's true in academia. It's true in a syllabus in many cases. The ideas of women and people of color are at the bottom of the list. They're the recommended alternative readings if you have time on the side, but not the core ideas. So just wanted to add a few points about that.
Thank you. Before we run out of time, I still also want to say a couple of things and connect that to one larger question, although I would have a lot of more questions. One is maybe to just explain, and it's just pragmatic, that just now we were able, after years, to open the basement galleries, make more space for the permanent collection, and also have a distinct teaching gallery there. And your exhibition, by accident, is a teaching gallery exhibition, and so that explains. And the placement, without that I want to defend it or anything else, it's just more or less really pragmatic of where it is, but I don't disagree generally on what you just said. One thing, though, what comes out of that and what maybe would be a topic is racism today is certainly an issue in the United States of America, but it is also globally an issue. It becomes more and more one every time you turn on the TV and look at the news of what is happening in other places in the world. The issue of racism and racist violence becomes more and more important. And with that, exhibitions about that topic become more important, historical exhibitions and art exhibitions. But there's also the question, if the museum today, and specifically an academic art museum as the Kemper is this museum really the ideal site for such an exhibition? Or is it maybe the public sphere? Should your next exhibition pop up, I don't know where, in St. Louis, for example, or virtually a site which even more people would access? The question is maybe to discuss the role of the art museum as a site for such exhibitions, which also have the intention of change, and the role of the public sphere, which originally is really the sphere for democratic discussion and of how we debate opinions with each other, and how we find really a public for who we are as a society. So it has this kind of stronger, maybe even civic a notion to it. And I don't know if we always use it like that. So in that case, I just wanted to bring up this one question one more time. Is the museum the ideal site, or is it the public sphere, or do both of them have their advantages and disadvantages? As maybe a last question, before you can just go ahead and tell us a little bit more about the Remembrance Coalition you just founded. Whoever wants to start. Tabari, do you want to start? Or?
No.
Jeff? No. Jeff.
I think museums, this particular museum is interesting in a lot of ways. I don't know that there's a single ideal site. I think as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's there's a lot of activity around these same issues that's happening for people with, being led by people working in various ways. I think artists and creative people are at the forefront of this country's reckoning with these histories to the extent that is happening at all. Certainly the state is not simply lagging, but is hostile to this kind of acknowledgement and the reparation that is called for, and the idea of reconciliation. So it's working against that tremendous pressure. There's a professor here at WashU in political science who describes this as motivated ignorance. This kind of willful ignorance is something that we're working against. And from that point of view, I think any place that we can engage productively around these issues is a good place. One of the things that I think is advantageous about museums is that they're built to be dynamic. They're meant to change. They're meant to evolve. And that's less so, although monuments and memorials are also dynamic. They're not as fixed as they often seem, even when built with stone and metal and so forth. They too change. But it's more of a monumental undertaking to actually build those things and to get community consensus around what they should say and to get permissions and so on. In some ways, the pop-up memorial museum I'm describing here reminds me of the German or Austrian, I don't remember where he's from, artist's intervention with the stumbling blocks, these Stolperstein that he doesn't ask permission to install in the sidewalk, but he uses to invite people to reflect where they are. And so I think there's an advantage to that, although I should say, and I'm going to stop here, if you would let me take with me the Kara Walker and Glenn Ligon and other works, and I would be, we could put them up in my house and we could have a public exhibition there.
Let's talk later about that.
I think it's going to be up to the leadership of institutions to decide what museums are going to be and what role they're going to play in society as we move forward. Everything from architecture to what's allowed in the space in regards to touching items, etc. Because one thing that I'm very clear on as a human being, it's like certain structures I just don't want to enter. I'm not a fan of brutalist, architecture because it is its name. It is cold and it feels awful and it reminds me of a prison. However, when I get inside, it's a totally different experience. And what we see in the city of St. Louis is that these structures are plopped down into the middle of communities. Communities that have experienced displacement, communities that have experienced mass incarceration. So when we start to think about what does a museum look like, is it inviting? And how does the leadership represent itself outside of the realm of the museum and the art world? Because I can't name many leaders of art museums who literally go into community and engage community in a way where it is not in part of an exhibit or some sort of partnership in regards to that. So I think it really does come down to, we have to start thinking about museums differently. Tabari?
So as I think about that question, I'm struck by what would give the most amount of visibility to any of these issues. And so both museums and just the broader community, I think, have places for these discussions. I would never want to limit it. There are museums that I'm often not as comfortable in, primarily because I don't see myself nor my experiences there. And if those are places that are going to be telling my story, then I think that that's valuable for the people who might frequent those places more than I would. At the same time, I think about places in our community where some of those same patrons would also never visit. And so making sure that we're creating space for everyone to be able to receive the message, and wherever that is. And I think that would give us the greatest amount of visibility, which would then ultimately create hopefully more accountability and awareness of these issues. You know, as part of my profession, I'm constantly having conversations with our broader community about ways in which our history is still playing out today. But I don't feel like we're being as effective because it's not consistent enough. I don't think enough people are talking about this. I think it's great that folks are here right now, but what about tomorrow? And what about Thursday? And what about talking to your kids and grandkids? And what about talking to your neighbors? And especially in the current environment, I think that there's a hesitancy, or we're operating in these echo chambers, and I think museums play a role in helping bring awareness about things, as do other public places that people just frequent. So I think it's a combination of both environments.
Maybe just quickly, thank you so much. I know that it's time for us to turn the discussion over to all of you, but nevertheless, Jeff, maybe one or two words about your Remembrance Coalition to let us know?
Yeah, thank you. I also I neglected to thank you, Jane. I mentioned the long essay. Jane and I worked for it feels like a year on editing this piece, and I just wanted to thank you for your work and your part in bringing this all together. The coalition that really all of us, I'm hoping Tabari is a part of as well. I'm going to say he is, and then put pressure on him that way. But I think there are some others here as well who are engaged in this work. So. The Equal Justice Initiative has, as I mentioned, launched this National Memorial to Peace and Justice, which involves an attempt to bring the nation into a practice of reckoning with histories and legacies of racial terror. Their focus in particular is lynching and the legacy of mass incarceration and capital punishment and other contemporary outcomes. But a part of that model is to challenge local communities to engage in what they call community remembrance work, the basis of which is people coming together and acknowledging histories of atrocity in their own communities and engaging in collective efforts to essentially to recognize that these things happen in these places, and to and through acknowledgement move further in the direction of reparation and ultimately reconciliation. So through practices like soil gathering at sites of atrocity and the erection of historical markers and memorials, through this remembrance work, the theory is that not only will places do more to acknowledge these histories that are so often erased, neglected, notwithstanding their continued impacts. But by coming together and forming these coalitions, the idea is that these local communities will also create the kind of political culture necessary to do more fundamental and structural change. So out of this coalition that comes together to, say, acknowledge the history of atrocity, you also have then a group of people who might work on issues like equal access to quality health care or education or affordable housing, things like rethinking museums, all sorts of things that we could think of that are also necessary to do if we are to realize something like transformative transitional justice. So St. Louis is one of, there are about 6 of these coalitions in Missouri right now. There's a group here at this first table from Franklin County. Can you raise your hand? Who've been working on this issue. They've been sort of at the forefront in Missouri with some other folks from Kansas City. There's a group in Springfield, Missouri. There's a group in Columbia and a few other places. And here in St. Louis, Shiraz and I and Nicholas Hoffman from Missouri History Museum and some folks from the Ethical Society of St. Louis and other institutions, the Griot Museum and elsewhere, have formed a coalition we started at the end of last year. And we are beginning to develop plans for community remembrance work around the EJI model, but I think also our idea is to work beyond that framework and support other initiatives like the Venable Park Coalition and the important work it's done to acknowledge the dispossession of the Venable family in Creve Coeur and the renaming of that park, which just happened within the past month or so. So there's a lot of work obviously to do here to really deal with the history and legacy of East St. Louis, the atrocity there and its imprint across the region. I mean, I could go on and on, I won't, but let me just make one last point about St. Louis. St. Louis is, if you think about the Mississippi River Valley, St. Louis is a catchment area for a deep, deep history of racist violence and dispossession related to the history of settler colonialism, of enslavement, of racial terror. Besides all of the things that have happened here, so much of the dispossession, the harm that has happened farther south has settled here over generations, compounding really the inequality in this region. And this isn't, of course, the only place, but it is an important place geographically because of the river and because St. Louis's history is in terms of the transportation corridors. So there's so much for us to deal with here in St. Louis that is of St. Louisans' own making and that's really fundamentally part of a national story. Shiraz was saying there are probably descendants in the room. I want us to think also, though, about beyond the genealogical descendants. We are all structural descendants. We are all connected structurally to this history. And there's one object that maybe I can take home from the exhibition, which is the one photograph that I took.
Maybe.
You probably signed something where I don't own that anymore, but I have a copy of it. But it's a photograph of the St. Louis County historical marker that sits outside. I was going to say this in relation to the last question about the warning about the presence of the past. But it's also an example of the kind of thing that I want our coalition to focus on. Outside the St. Louis County Police Headquarters in downtown Clayton stands an historical marker that very explicitly defines St. Louis County as a white place. If you missed it, go back, take a look at it, or email me. I'll send you a copy. I'm happy. I carry this thing around. I'm going to get something made with this. But the thing about that, so think about this. There's a sign outside the St. Louis County Police Headquarters that says St. Louis County is a white place. It doesn't literally say that, but it's pretty explicit in its characterization of this place in these racist terms. And so this is an example, on the one hand, of how the landscape carries the memory of this past I've been talking about it and reproduces it. And it's cited in a place that we should not be, we can reasonably expect routinely compromises equal protection under law. It's also an example, though, of the illusion that we can't do anything about the past. Not only is that illusion because the past is present, but because we can clearly do things to change the meaning of the past today, the representation of the past today. And that is the kind of thing that the coalition here in St. Louis and the coalitions around Missouri and around the country are working on. Do you want to add anything about the coalition?
So we will be working on our first site, which will be in April. And this site is going to be surprising to a lot of people because it is the beloved Keener Plaza, the Macintosh lynching. And we would like you all's support in raising awareness about this because they did that whole fabulous thing at Keener Plaza, developed a whole area for children. Which speaks to the larger narrative of St. Louis about the gross erasure of certain things that have happened in certain places and the need to sanitize, to get rid of, right? And we know that is quite potentially going to be pretty incendiary. However, if we are to move forward, we have to acknowledge the trauma that is in the ground. because we live with it. It is our old ghost. And in order for us to move forward, there needs to not only be an acknowledgement, there needs to be an exercising of that, and potentially ritual that takes place to heal that psychic memory that actually exists there. So just wanted to raise everybody's awareness about that coming this April.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists here. Thank you so much for participating today. I do want to turn the discussion now over to all of you. There's some questions on the table that you can take as suggestions, but I know that there are also other issues which came up and which the panelists brought up, which you might feel as more important. Overall, I just want to say thank you so much, and I hope that we can continue this also within the museum. Thanks.